Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our topic will be on how to play against the Philidor's defense. Some ideas, strategical and tactical, as well as on how to develop an attack. Well, let's get started with our first example. Here we go. e4, e5, knight f3, developing while attacking the pawn on e5. And now, if black protects the pawn on e5 with the d pawn compared to with a knight, for example, on c6, this is called the Philidor defense. There is an obvious drawback of this setup for black, namely that the bishop on f8 is more limited in movement than if the pawn would only go to d6 after that bishop gets out, for example, to c5. Now white's typical continuation is to play d4, immediately fighting for the center and in fact attacking black's e5 pawn a second time. Here black has two main roads. One is to develop with the knight and protect the pawn a second time, and the other one is, as black continued, to trade the pawns immediately. That's what happened in this game, and white recaptured naturally with the knight and not with the queen, because if the queen would capture, then immediately the black knight could come out on c6. So generally that's an inferior way. We usually prefer not to bring out our queens prematurely unless it's the only way to avoid losing material or gain material advantage. So knight captured back and black continued developing very naturally, as well as attacking immediately white's pawn on e4. Came knight c3 and bishop e7 for black, and white continued developing with bishop c4. Another method of development would be here to try to develop the dark squared bishop quickly, move the queen out to d2 and castle to the queen side, and that would allow a quick attack possibly on the king side. I wouldn't say it's better, but it's a more ambitious way to continue. This game continued with bishop c4, very natural move, getting ready to castle on the king side, which is the typical safe way to play. And black castled, putting the king to safety. And so did white. And this is an interesting momentum in the game where black decided to take the initiative and do a little combination to free up his position a little bit, trade some pieces, because as we can see right now, white has a more advanced pawn on e4 on the 4th rank, while black has a pawn on d6, which from his side of the board is on the 3rd rank of the board. So therefore, at the moment, white has a slight space advantage based on these two pawns. And what black tried was rather interesting, namely to trade the knight for the pawn, but this is a temporary sacrifice, because the whole idea is that when the white knight captures black's knight, then black would do a fork with the pawn, attacking the white bishop and knight. And now, if either moves away, the other minor piece will be lost. And of course, very importantly, the d5 pawn is protected by black's queen, so it wouldn't help white to take the pawn with the bishop right now either, because the black queen would capture back, and then there would be again material equality, and black would actually have an excellent position, having two bishops, the pair of bishops, while white has an extra knight, it's true, but generally it's a good idea to have both bishops. They work together real well in pairs. Therefore, white preferred to give up the knight compared to the bishop. Now it's quite important not to just give up the knight for nothing, but try to get at least a pawn. Try to think what would be that move that saves the white bishop And then when black captures the knight on e4, white will win the pawn back. Because if white will not have the option to then capture black's pawn, then black would remain a pawn ahead. Remember, black just captured a pawn on e4. So therefore, very typical idea in similar situations, the bishop retreats to d3, and then when pawn captures knight, bishop captures. Okay, so we're through this first little combination in this game. Let's evaluate what happened. Well, a pair of knights and a pair of pawns have been gone from the board. Okay, that's for one. The position is symmetrical right now as of the pawn structure concerned, and white has a little bit of activity, some advantage in development, in that white already has two pieces well positioned in the middle of the board, while black still has all of the queen side undeveloped. It's also important to note that black has some difficulty in getting his bishop out of c8, because if it tries to move, the pawn on b7 will be unprotected. So black can't just move it so easily. Now there were some games where black continued in this position with bishop to f6, and white protected the knight with c3. Here came rook e8, then white protected the bishop with the queen, came g6 to protect the pawn, and then bishop f4, and white had some advantage. Let's go back again. After bishop e4, black continued with knight d7 in this game, and white responded with knight f5. A very powerful move. On one hand, keeps an eye on the bishop. As we said, generally it's a good idea to trade a knight for a bishop and gain the so-called advantage of pair of bishops. And of course the knight in this case is in a very attacking position as well. In some cases the knight may be aided by the queen and create some checkmate threats. But black in the meantime prepared for everything and played bishop f6, avoiding the threatening trade of the knight for the bishop, as well as putting a backup defender already now on the g7 square. So therefore at this moment queen g4 doesn't make much sense, as the g7 pawn is already well protected. Moreover, black would be ready to move and centralize his knight and immediately attack white's queen. So therefore queen g4 wouldn't have been the greatest idea, and white simply continued developing and improving his position by playing bishop to e3. It's true that white temporarily sacrifices the b2 pawn with his last move. However, after rook b1 attacking the bishop, another very typical idea, white regains the pawn real quick after bishop takes on b7. After bishop e3, black chose a worse route. Black played g6. Well, if this knight would have to retreat, let's say to g3, then black's move would be justified. The problem is that this last move of black's weakens seriously dark squares around the black king. So the knight can go to h6. That is the problem. If now the king goes to g7, white would respond with knight g4, which on one hand would threaten with bishop h6 check, an immediate skewer, and on the other hand would also threaten the potential trade of the knight for a bishop. The king went in the actual game to h8, trying to avoid that dual threat, but the problem is black couldn't really avoid it long term, because white continued now with bishop to d5, attacking black's f7 pawn a second time. King now moved to g7, and now we're back to the same problem. Knight g4 arrived with the immediate threat of bishop h6. Black's king had to move. And now white, of course, already could trade knight for bishop, but was aiming for even more. Came queen to f3, putting pressure on black's bishop. If the bishop would run, the problem would be that white immediately would check, and of course if king moves, the pawn on f7 is gone, or if bishop takes knight, bishop takes, attacking the rook on f8, and if the rook moves, then white checkmates in 2 moves after queen captures the pawn on f7. So things don't look rosy for black at all, and black played rook e8, which didn't help the situation. White already has excellent options. Knight h6 certainly doesn't look bad, but white played even more ambitiously by bishop h6. This is one of those scenarios when black almost is in zugzwang, have hardly any moves that doesn't worsen their position. Look at what's going on. If the black knight would move at any place, that would mean that the black bishop is not sufficiently protected, and white could simply capture that. If the bishop would move, that would open up the f-file for white's queen. That doesn't work either. If the rook would try to protect the f7 pawn, then again the bishop is not protected sufficiently. So we can see how black hardly has any moves. If the king moves, the f7 pawn is hanging. The bishop on c8 has no moves, period. The rook on a8, well, doesn't have any useful moves. So black tried in the game to play c6, chasing the white bishop away. However, now it was time for white to involve yet another new piece in the attack. And now, surprisingly, white doesn't even need to waste time in moving the bishop away. White has an elegant move in bringing the rook, the sleeping rook, the only one that hasn't moved yet, to the game with rook e1. Now black is in major trouble. Black resigned in the actual game, in fact, because if pawn takes bishop, then knight takes, and now the elegant queen f6 ends the game, with checkmate coming up right on the next move, threatening on g7, and of course if queen takes queen, then the back rank checkmate. Very, very elegant. Alternatively, if after rook e1 black trades rooks first, not much changes, the threat is rather similar. For example, if na takes, again takes, queen takes, and checkmate on the next move. What a beautiful game, and also an important lesson that even though the position can look symmetrical and almost harmless, like we look at this position, trouble can happen real quick if the other side or one side develops a quick attack and a harmony between the pieces. And especially you have to be very careful in weakening squares around your king. Like remember, after bishop e3 in this position, black played g6, and that was the cause most of black's troubles. After seeing this very instructive game on how to develop an attack, let's see another game where white developed an even quicker attack, or rather black fell into a famous opening trap. Let's see that yet again in the same opening. Let's get started. Again, it's the Philidor defense. Black plays d6 on the second move, and white played d4, just like in the last one, and in this game black played slightly differently, didn't trade on d4 all that quickly, but developed first with the knight, counter-attacking white's pawn on e4. For example, if pawn takes, knight takes, and black is okay. White, instead, in the game, continued developing himself while protecting the e4 pawn. Remember, the black e5 pawn is under attack right now, both by white's pawn and knight. So therefore came knight b to d7, protecting it. And white continues with bishop c4, a very typical way for these type of openings. It immediately creates a very serious threat of playing knight to g5 and attacking black's weakest point, the f7 pawn, a second time. Remember, that is a very serious threat, unless the typical defense is, if you're ready to castle, then it's not a problem. So black safely played bishop e7 because if now knight g5, black is ready to castle and protect that pawn a second time. These type of trades on f7 don't bring much to white because it's only a trade of a bishop and a knight versus a rook and pawn. And the point is that white wasted a lot of time moving the bishop twice and the knight 3 times just to achieve a trade of trading 6 points for 6 points. So therefore a better approach here is to simply castle, which white did in the game, and so did black. Both sides have castled, so we're having a very normal standard position. Here a very typical move would be to play rook e1, for example, but white chose a different tricky move, and I'm personally not a great fan of tricks, but nevertheless, if you happen to find yourself on the black side of this position, you better be aware of it. White played queen e2, which I don't think is the greatest idea, because it's likely that the black rook soon will go to e8, and then there is that potential danger. It's usually not a good idea to have your queen on the same file as the opponent's rook is. However, as you shall see, black has to be careful and first should have played in this position c6, a very typical move which accomplishes a number of things. On one hand, keeps control of the d5 square. Another important idea is to let the queen out, and thirdly, prepare in some cases to play b5 and then develop the bishop to b7. So it's a very good multi-purpose move that's considered very typical for this type of positions. In fact, white's usual response to it would be to play a4, preventing the attack on the bishop. However, in this game, black played differently by trading on d4, and when white captured back, black made actually a big mistake. A very natural looking move, rook e8, but it gives away the game. Black here, instead of rook e8, should have played knight e5, for example, to avoid the tragedy that occurred after rook e8. I suggest you take a little bit of time and try to figure out why this move may be all that bad, and then come back and see what happened in the actual game. The game continued by white's immediate sacrifice and winning attack. Bishop f7. Wow, giving a bishop up just for a pawn. Well, you'll see it's not just a pawn. Obviously, if black does not accept the bishop sacrifice, black is completely lost, because not only that the bishop can capture the rook right away, but even worse, white's knight can trap the black queen. So therefore, black has no choice but try to accept the sacrificed piece. Now an important point, that if white would immediately play here queen c4, black actually would be saved, or pretty much okay, after d5. And here came the surprise, which I bet was the move that black overlooked in the game, and that is a second sacrifice sacrificing the knight. Again, the queen is trapped, so the only challenging move is to accept the sacrifice. Amazingly, black is up 2 pieces already. However, is in a completely lost position. Why? Because their king is walking around in the middle of the board, and that can rarely lead to anything good. Of course, white needs to hit the iron while it's hot and chase the king. Queen c4 check. Of course, if the king moves further ahead, the checkmate comes immediately with f4. That's really bad. So black pretty much has to block it. And now again we want to capture on d5 with a check. And while black has various choices right now, none of them really lead to safety for black's king. For example, if the king goes to d6, white would continue the chase with the knight, king e5, continue the chase with the rook, king f5, continue the chase with the queen, and finally, voila, checkmate. Wow! That's what happens when a king is wandering around. If knight captures on d5 right now, white could simply capture back actually with a knight. Remember, now black is up only 1 piece at this point. But very importantly, the white knight threatens all kind of discovered checks or even double checks. For example, with knight c7 or knight f4. Black's situation is totally hopeless. For example, if king d6, among other ways, knight c7 wins right away, and if queen takes, rook d1 check, and black's queen falls. Another variation may be if after knight d5, black plays knight e5, attacking white's queen, then indeed the double check comes, check from the queen and check from the knight. Now if king f6, then the attacked queen moves to f4, and black has a bunch of pieces hanging, and if bishop f5, white can even check again and pick up this bishop before capturing either of the rooks. Or after knight d5, knight e5, knight c7 check. If the king goes the other direction to d7, then rook d1, bishop d6, and white is ready for yet another sacrifice. Rook takes. As you notice, everything is coming with a check. Queen takes, and bishop f4. Well, finally a quiet move, a move that pins black's knight and is ready to get the white rook into the attack, whether to d1 or e1, and it's quite clear that the black knight will be lost real quick, while the black king is still in a miserable situation. And finally, let's see what happens if the king tries to go back and hide towards the corner. Now comes d6, this cover check, very important. And amazingly again, if the king moves down, the black queen gets trapped. See another reason why black should have played c6 on move 7, as I mentioned. So black played knight d5, and now white simply gets all the material back while maintaining the attack. Now white is already a pawn up while the black rook is hanging, and if the rook moves away, doesn't really matter where, white will be ready to win further material. What a beautiful example, and certainly both of these games demonstrate how not to play on the black end. But I hope it gave you some valuable ideas that you may use if your opponent chooses to play the Philidor. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess ideas. Bye-bye.